We're going to be spending some time together on reading. If I had to give this a title, it'd probably be How to Read a Book. The purpose of reading is simple, any reading. It is to gain an increase in understanding. I want to know more at the end of the reading than I did when I started. I want to understand more and better even than when I first started the reading. There's a feeling in the world today, even in some parts of education, that reading is not as important as it used to be. Because we've got video cassette, we've got TV, we've got radio, we've got the internet, we've got all these ways that are taking the place of reading. And that's probably why people have a problem in thinking today, is they let the TV think for them. They let the radio and the man on the radio think for them. If they want to find something out, they can get just a short sound bite of it or a short bit of it on the internet. If they really want to know something in any detail, they can research it again on the internet, and they can print it up, and they can put it in on their video, on their computer presentation. And we've really lost the thought that reading is the most essential part of education. It's always been that way. There never has been a time that anything was more important to understanding than reading. Now, in our study today, we're going to talk about reading in general, and then we're going to talk about the way that reading specifically will benefit us at Sunset International Bible Institute. There are some people today that are beginning to advocate the fact that our minds are inundated with so many facts to the hindrance of understanding. We know lots of things, but we don't know much about what we know of those things that we know. Because of that, when asked a question, whether it's on a test while you're in the school, or somebody comes in for counseling, or I'm asked to preach on a certain subject, we often insert a packaged opinion in our mind, much like we put a cassette in the car radio. We push a button, and we play back the opinion whenever and wherever it seems appropriate to do so. We have performed acceptably without having to think. That's a great detriment to understanding God and understanding His will. We need to talk, first of all, briefly, about the activity and the art of reading. I want to talk about what I call active reading. And that's where the reader interacts with what he's reading. He's not passive. He's just not acquiring knowledge. And this also would apply as you're listening to your teachers while you attend the school here. I like to compare it to a baseball game. In a baseball game, the pitcher throws the ball and the catcher catches the ball. Neither one of them are passive. And neither one of them can exist without the other. The only thing that's passive there is the ball. It just got thrown and it got caught. Or, to use another figure from a ball game, a hitter and a fielder. The hitter hits the ball and the fielder catches the ball. He hopes in the air. If not, he hopes he can throw the fella out at first base. Again, the only thing that is passive is the ball. The hitter's not passive, he hit the ball. The fielder's not passive, he caught the ball and threw the ball, and the first baseman caught the ball. The only thing passive in that ball game is the ball that's being tossed about. Well, that's exactly the way it is in reading, or even in listening to a lecture. When I'm reading a book, the book is sending a message, and I am receiving the message. The message is the only thing that's passive. I interacted with what I read. I got involved with what I read. And that's what you'll do with the teachers while you're here in the Institute. They will talk and dispense the knowledge that they've gained from their study, and you will interact by receiving that, by accepting that. A lot of times today, a lot of times today, a student will say, we don't have enough interaction in the classroom. By that it means he doesn't get to talking much. Well, really, to be honest, did you come to talk? Or did you come to receive a knowledge of what God would have you to do and say in His pulpit and in His church? If there's no interaction, whose fault is it? It's not the fault of the message, it's passive. It's not the fault of the teacher, he transmitted. It must be the fault of the receiver, the catcher behind that catches the pitch, the fielder that catches the hit. So when you are reading or when you're listening to something the teacher says, do not forget that your responsibility is to interact. Active reading is learning the facts and then performing those facts with ever increasing and involved skill. Get involved in what you read and what you hear. I think it'd be good for us to think a moment about the goals of reading. There are two goals anytime we read. Number one is information. Number two is understanding. Both are essential. And the second, understanding, is built on the first, knowledge. But in our context on this little bit of study together here, we're going to look at understanding more than knowledge. Because understanding is the goal of knowledge. When I teach you Bible History 1, you'll learn 33 facts that fit on an Old Testament, on a map of the Old Testament world. The goal is not that knowledge. The goal is being able to understand when Abraham is at a certain place and when Jacob is at a certain place and how those places will interact with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and bring about an understanding of the way that God worked in that life, in that place, and with that event. But if I don't know the place and I don't know the event and I don't know the person, how can I gain any understanding at all? We want to talk for a little bit now about reading as learning. We need to see the difference between learning by instruction and learning by discovery. And both of those, reading is necessary to both of those, but particularly to the second. And that is learning by discovery. We need to see the difference in those. When we talk about learning by instruction, we're informed and we're enlightened by what the teacher has to say. When you're studying Bible history with me, I'll try to present some facts and some events and some circumstances and some principles. And in doing that, I'm trying to inform you, to know something, to know that it's true because it's simply the case. But I want more than information. I want more than informing you. I wish for you to be enlightened. And that is to know, in addition to the case, what that case is about. Now, being informed is prerequisite to being enlightened. You must be informed before you can ever be enlightened. The point, however, is not to stop at being informed. Now, learn by instruction doesn't necessarily demand that you read something. Rather than reading it, you may hear from the teacher what he's read. But there must be some reading somewhere in the teacher's mind and in your mind before there can ever be enlightenment, before there can ever be information. But I want to talk more about learning by discovery. This is where reading really takes over, because reading enables me to discover something and not simply to receive it from somebody else. It's interesting to me that the Greeks had a word for people that were just informed. They were not enlightened. They could spout a lot of things from memory. They could tell you a lot about it, an atomic table, or they could tell you about the history of the Greeks, or they could tell you about the philosophy of Plato. They could tell you information, facts that they gained. The Greeks had a word for people that were just informed, and it was the word sophomore. Isn't that interesting? I'm told that freshmen arrive at school bright-eyed, ready to listen to everything, and they don't even know what to ask. But sophomores already know all the answers to all the questions. Juniors have learned what the questions are, and seniors have learned the exceptions, and in graduate school they learn how to deal with life. We don't want to be sophomores. We don't want to be people that are so informed and our heads so full of facts that we think by learning something, by being informed about it and enlightened about it, we therefore know it. We don't know anything except what we discover on our own. What do I mean by discovery? I mean the process of learning something by research, learning it by investigation, learning it by reflecting on that research and that investigation without being taught. And there's where reading takes place, doesn't it? I read a good book, or I read a part of a good book. I research what it says, I investigate what it says, I reflect on what it says, and I discover the truth that is there. Now, we as teachers are going to be able to help you in many ways. We're going to guide, perhaps, some of your reading, guide some of your discovery. But if you yourself, it's you yourself that must do the learning. Knowledge must grow in your own mind if learning is to take place. And that brings up a question. What about thinking? Where does thinking come in? Most people regard thinking as more closely associated with research and unaided discovery than than being taught. The reason for that is that they suppose that reading and listening are relatively effortless and passive. Reading is hard work. Solomon says, much study is a weariness of the flesh, and of writing books there is no end. Now, Richard's sort of paraphrase of that is, you get real tired when you study and there's always another book to read. Because that's what Solomon said. No matter how much I've learned, and it was tiring and it was hard to learn. But no matter how much I learned, there's still something more to learn. Paul said, if any man says, I know something, Paul said he didn't know anything yet, as he ought to know it. Now, the art of reading includes all of the same skills that are involved in the art of unaided discovery. We teachers in the school, the administration school, want you to discover the truth. We want that eureka moment, that I found it moment, that moment said, yeah, a yeah moment. We want that to occur over and over again. As on your own, outside of class, in your study and research, you'll read something that makes what was said in class all of a sudden bloom like a rose and come to full blossom in your heart. Here are some things that you will want to develop as you begin to learn to read actively. You'll want to be able, you'll want to gain the ability of keenness of observation. Look at it. Think about it. Don't just soak it in because one of the teachers said it. Really be keen in your observation of it. Then remember it. Readily available memory. Now, as I teach you Bible History 1 and 2, during those 2 sessions, you'll memorize something like 1,000 facts. Those are not just chosen randomly. Those are from God's Word and in order, and you need to be able to remember those things. That's why we're going to memorize it. Modern education sometimes scoffs at memory, but where there is no memory, there is no learning. You want to develop a range of imagination. You want to be able to walk with Abraham. You want to be able to talk with Joseph. Listen to David sing. You want to be able to sit down on the mount and listen to Jesus preach that fabulous sermon. You want to be able to see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. When you get to the book of Revelation, that book was addressed totally to the imagination. And so we begin to develop a range of imagination that lets us see things. But most of all, most important of all, you need to develop an intellect that is trained in analysis and in reflection. You'll be able to take something apart. Oh, we haven't talked a lot about reading yet, have we? We've talked about the mind and the way the mind needs to be attached to the reading. We've talked about us personally and how we need to interact with what we're reading. But I want to spend a good while here talking about the levels of reading. Not all reading is the same. Today there's a big emphasis on speed reading. There are some things you do not want to read by speed reading, like love letters or like an epistle from Paul. There are some things that are not given to be read speedily. Other things are. But no matter whether we read it fast or we read it slow, there are 4 levels of reading. Let's list them, then let's come back and discuss them. There is elementary reading, inspectional reading, analytical reading, and synoptic reading. Now those words may not be understood right now, but that's all right. You don't need to understand something the first time you hear it. The discussion will make it clearer, or the research will make it clearer. And I hope that many of you do further research this material. There's some pretty good books on the art of reading. One called How to Read a Book. I'll think of the author's name in a minute and let you know. It's in a syllabus that you can get from me. But elementary reading is the first kind of reading. That's where for the first time a little boy or little girl looks at C-A-T and she says, or he says, cat. Then there's a picture of a cat so that he associates the cat with the picture, so the next time he sees the cat, he can point at it and say cat. Then he sees hat. It looks a whole lot like cat, difference of H and a C, but there's a picture there of the hat. So the next time he sees his daddy or his mother put on a hat, he can point at it and say hat. And then there's bat. That looks a whole lot like it. And a bat is either a winged mammal or it's a thing you hit a ball with. But maybe it's a picture of the thing you hit a ball with. He calls that bat. But then he sees the bird and he doesn't know what to call that. Why? He hadn't got to that yet in his reading. Elementary reading is rudimentary reading, basic reading. And it answers this question. Answers 2 questions. What does this word mean? Or what does this sentence say? Now I'm sure, everybody that's listening and watching this is already beyond elementary reading. They've already learned how to read words and how to read sentences and how to read paragraphs and recognize the difference between them. But that's the first level of reading that must be attained before you can go to second. The second level of reading is what I call inspectional reading. This is systematic skimming. It's not just skimming through something. It's systematically skimming through it. And it's going to answer the question, what's this book, or what's this paragraph, or what's this paper, or what's this theme about? What is this about? In order to answer that question, we're going to depend preeminently on being a demanding reader. When I read something, even when it's an inspectional reading, just to see what this is about, I need to be a demanding reader. The essence of active reading has in it 4 basic questions. What is this book about as a whole? What is being said in detail? Is this book true? So what? What of it? You need to make anything you read your own. It belongs to you. That's why even when you're skimming something, I'd suggest a pencil in your hand. I read every morning 10 chapters of the Old Testament, 10 chapters of the New Testament, 5 Psalms and 1 proverb. But always read those with a pencil in hand so I can circle the things I want to come back and look at later. Now I'm reading very quickly. I'm systematically skimming, but I'm still checking it off with that pencil. I'm underlining the major and forceful points. I'm putting vertical lines in the margin to say you need to look at all of this. I'm putting a star there, or an asterisk there, maybe NB, which means note well, or 10 with a star beside it, which means very, very important, or crux, C-R-U-X, which means crucial to the point in the argument. Put numbers out in the margin to show 1, 2, 3, 4, sequence of points. Circle key words or phrases. Write in the margin, top or bottom, your questions that you will answer later, answers that you see, comments that you want to make. That's what we're beginning to call inspectional reading. When I do that, I look at the title page. I look at the preface. In the title page, it says origin of species. Not origin of the species. That'd be different. Origin of species. Darwin is not talking about the beginning of things. He's talking about the multiplicity of things. Then I look at the preface and see what the writer or maybe the publisher has to say about this book. I study the table of contents to obtain a general sense of the book's structure. I check the index to see the topics discussed in the book. If it still has a jacket on it, I go and read the publisher's blurb about the book and read about the author so I can know a little bit about him. I look at the chapters as I look through the table of contents. I look at chapters and ask the question, which one of these are pivotal to his book? Then I turn through the book very quickly, stopping every now and then where it appears as if the author is making what he considers to be an important point. That's systematic skimming. I inspect the book. It's also superficial reading, where you're never stopping to look up. You're never stopping to ponder the things you did not understand the first time. You're just trying to get the flavor of the book. What is this book about? The third lesson, now you got to go through that one to get to the third one. You've got to learn to read elementally before you can read inspectionally. You've got to read inspectionally before you can read analytically. But the third step is an analytical reading. This is a thorough reading and a complete reading of the entire book or article or theme or paper or whatever you're wanting to read. And it answers this question. First, elementary reading answers the question, what is this sentence saying? Then inspectional reading asks the question, what is this book about? Analytical reading asks the question, or answers the question, what does this book mean? What does this book have to say? Not just what it says, but what does it have to say? What does this book mean? This kind of reading is preeminently for the sake of understanding. That's why, again, you need the 4 questions that active reading asks, and you need to learn how to make that book your own. I preached a sermon one time that I'd gotten the outline from, many of the points from, a book I owned. Somebody asked me, is that sermon really yours? I said, well, of course it is. I paid $10.95 for the book it was in. That made it mine. No, it didn't. What made it mine was a careful, analytical reading where I agreed with his points and added my personality and my scriptures and myself to what he had to say till that sermon was no longer his sermon. I got the impetus from him. I got the information from him. I got the understanding from him. But I made that sermon mine by reception. I interacted with what I read. There's where analysis really takes place. There are 4 rules in analytical reading. You can get these in other books, in books on reading, but I'm going to put them in my words. And sometimes there's 5 or 6, or I even have a book that has 10 rules of analytical reading. That's too many. They're repetitious. There's really only 4 rules of analytical reading. Number 1, rule 1, you must know what kind of book you're reading. You must know that. If I'm reading a novel, I don't want to read it as if it were history. If I'm reading history, I don't want to read it as if it were a novel. If I'm reading an allegory, I don't want to read it as if it were straightforward language. If I'm reading a poem, I don't want to read it as if it were a theme on or a statement of the binomial theorem. You must know what kind of book you're reading. And you should know it as early as possible, preferably even before you start to reading. Now, sometimes that's impossible to do because the author doesn't tell you in a preface or doesn't tell you in an introduction exactly what he is going to be saying, what kind of a book this is. But surely, a inspectional reading of skimming through it would answer the question, this is a book about blank. This is a book about understanding Scripture. This is a book about preaching. This is a book about counseling. This is a book about. This is a book about. I call that pigeonholing a book. What pigeonhole is this book going to fit in? Now, when I've got it there, I'm much more prepared to analyze what I read than if I just start reading a book and I don't have a clue what it's talking about. One way you can tell what a book's talking about is by the title of a book. Again, I made reference a while ago to Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. Nearly every time you see that quoted, it's the origin of the species, as if he were talking about the beginning of things. Read the book. I don't think he's right, but read the book. The book is not about creation. It's about cataloging all the things that presently exist. But as I read a title, no matter what it is, Natural Church Development, another title, or the Harmony of the Gospels, another title. As I read that title, it makes the subject matter clear, or at least clearer, or more nearly clear. It makes me know, here's what the fellow's going to talk about, or he mistitled the book. If you titled the book Natural Church Development and you talked about preaching, that'd be a wrong title, wouldn't it? You need preaching in the title, not church development. And it makes the grouping of books easier. On my shelf, I do not have the books arranged alphabetically. I've got them arranged by subject matter. Here are books on leadership. Here are books on church growth. Here are books on preaching. Here are books on, here are books on, here are books on. They're all arranged according to category. And the titles of the book, if you were to look across my library, the titles of the book would let you know what section you are in. So it makes the groupings of the books much easier. So as you get ready to read analytically, you must be able to answer, first of all, the question. The first rule is to know what kind of book you're going to be reading. Then you can ask the question. I'm still in rule 1. Then you can ask the question, is this book practical or is this book theoretical? By theoretical, I don't mean untrue. I simply mean the presentation of some doctrine, truth, or theory. When you say practical, you mean that this thing works in some way or another, or it works in the long run. But it's an idea. Practical is an idea. This has how-to in it. The most popular books in any bookstore in the world, Barnes & Noble or W.M. Smith or any of those, you go in and say, what book sells the most? And they'll tell you each time, without question, that it is the practical books. It is the how-to books. You want to make yourself $1 billion, just write a book on how to write a how-to book. And then you will have your fortune made. So practical meaning it works in some way or another, or it works now. It works in the long run. Key word is works. The word theoretical, or the idea of theoretical, is that's something to be seen, something to be understood. The beautiful thing about Paul's epistles is they're both theoretical and practical. In the first part of Ephesians 1, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 21, he's talking about the theory of the preeminence of the church or the beauty of the church. Then chapter 4 he says, so here's how you are to live. In Romans chapters 1 through 11 deals with the theory, the doctrine of justification by faith. And then 12 to 16 says, therefore, here's how you are to live. Here's how this works. So we will be reading, as we read in the epistles of the New Testament, particularly Paul's, of both theory and practice. Rule number 2 is always state the unity of the whole book in a single sentence, or at most in a short paragraph. John does that. John says, I'm writing these things that you may, in 1 John, he says, I'm writing these things that you may know you have eternal life. There's the unity of the book, the knowledge of eternal life. He does the same thing in the gospel. He said many other signs Jesus did, but these, which are not written here, but these are written that you may believe, and believing have life. So the unity of John's book of the gospel is life, to have it and to maintain it. Sometimes they don't tell you that though personally. Sometimes you have to figure that out by yourself. That's the way it is in the book of Ephesians. Paul does not in the book of Ephesians say, here's why I'm writing the book. But a reading of the book, it makes it very clear and very evident that he's writing that book to discuss the church. Now, rule 3, while we're thinking about Ephesians. Rule 3 is set forth the major parts of the book and show how those are organized into a whole, how they relate to each other, and how they relate to the whole unity of the book. This could be called viewing the book. That's mastering the multiplicity. Paul in Ephesians, in chapter 1, he says something about the church in every chapter. Chapter 1, he says the church is the fullness of Christ. Chapter 2, the saved by grace. Chapter 3, the eternal purpose of God. Chapter 4, the unity of God. Chapter 5, the bride of Christ. Chapter 6, the army of God. Now, I've got a hold of that now. I've analyzed that. And I've seen how these parts, each one important in itself, is only important in this book as it relates to all the others. In Rule 4, discover the author's intention. This could be called the problem within the book. What is he really trying to do? What's he trying to say? What's his intention in writing this book? That's different in subject matter. One consideration is, what subject does this book discuss? But the more important question is, why does this book discuss this? Why is the author taking the time to write on that one particular thing? I've got to come to terms with the author. Not simply as words, those have definitions in a book, but the terms that he uses. Have you ever used a term and found out it meant exactly the opposite to somebody else? I said one time that I do not believe in salvation by education. Well, one of my fellow teachers, I didn't know this, but he uses that constantly to say he believed in salvation by education. I meant that that salvation is not based on all of your intellect and all of your knowledge. He meant that you've got to know something to be saved. It sounded like we're contradicting each other. But when you understood our intention, then you understood that although the term seemed contradictory, it was not. Because the intention he had was to declare the necessity of knowledge for salvation. The intention of my statement of that was that all of our intellect and all of our education is not the reason we're saved. Two absolutely different things. So as I get ready to read a book, or as I'm reading a book, I want to try to figure out what this author is trying to say. I want to look for the key words. I want to recognize that he uses some technical words, that he has a special vocabulary that's just his. And I want to discover the meanings then behind of all that he says. I want to determine his message. I want to not only look at sentences, I want to look at propositions. I want to find, however, the key sentences in each paragraph and underline those or highlight those. I want to find where he's making propositional arguments. I want to find out the solutions that he offers to the problems of life. In short, I want to criticize his book fairly. I want to be teachable as I approach a book. Teachability is a virtue. If a person does not come to class, if he does not come to a book with teachability, learning the reason, he is not teachable. If he's not teachable, he can't be taught anything. If he's not taught anything, he can't understand anything. If he can't understand anything, he can't discover anything. If he can't discover anything, he's not worth anything. And so we need to really stress the concept of being teachable. We need to suspend judgment. A lot of times I'm reading a book, and a guy will make a statement, and I'll circle it, and I'll put a passage up there. How about this? And then on the next page, he discusses that very verse and shows how it relates to that. I need to suspend my judgment, didn't I? And let him get through with his argument and through with his presentation. I don't want to be contentious as I read a book. I don't want to look for reasons to differ with the author. Even if I think the author is a liberal, absolutely a bird brain, I still don't want to be contentious as I read his book. For anybody can teach me something, and I've never read a book in all of my life that didn't teach me at least one good thing that I didn't know before I read the book. But if I started out reading that book contentiously, I would not have learned it. And then I need to look the way he resolves the disagreements that he will have with himself, and that he will have with me, and that he will have with others. How do I know if I agree or disagree with an author? A lot of times I disagree because of my prejudice, because of my judgment. I judge his soundness. I say he's uninformed or misinformed or illogical. I judge his completeness and say his analysis is incomplete. Suppose all that's true. And sometimes it is. Some things that I write are wrong. I was uninformed, I was misinformed, I was illogical, I was incomplete, I didn't get through. That doesn't mean that everything I said was wrong. It doesn't mean that that book doesn't have any value simply because it does not express all that is to be expressed on any subject. I don't know any book that does that, even any one book of the Bible. That's why the sum of the word is truth, as David declared in the 119th Psalm. That's why when the devil quoted Jesus' scripture, quoted correctly, applied it to the right person. But Jesus said it's also written. It's written again. You see, when I'm reading any book, even the Bible, I must realize that the truth there is accumulative, that it's building one upon another. And I don't know all the truth until I've read all the book. And then I probably don't know all the truth. I've just read all the truth. There's some aids to reading. I'm talking about analytical reading. There's some aids to analytical reading, and that's relevant experience. I'm reading along in some book that's trying to show me some geographical facts, or some historical facts, some archaeological facts, and I've got some relevant experience that relates to that. I read a book one time about a certain temple in Thailand, and they discussed the temple and what it looked like and why it was there and how the people felt about it. I understood it instantly because I'd been there. I'd had the experience. I'd stood in that temple. I'd watched the people. I'd heard the explanation. I had relevant experience in what I was reading, so I grasped it more quickly. So bring your experience. Bring your lifestyle. Bring your life experiences to what you read. And then there's other books. I mean, I'm preaching a series right now in a little congregation on the letters of the 7 churches. Before I make my outline, I read 8 different books' discussion of that particular letter. Why? They each add something. They each give me something the other one doesn't give. So, well, you ought to just preach it on your own. If I did, it wouldn't be worth much. The very fact of life is that none of us know very much, but all of us together know a whole lot. And so we need to read other books. We need to read commentaries. We need to read reference books. We need to read dictionaries. We need to read encyclopedias. Does this sound like hard work to you? It is hard work. Solomon says much study is a weariness of the flesh. In the 2 years you're here in this school, you will do much study. Your flesh will get very weary. And there's always another book to read. So what do? You just drink some strong coffee and read on. You just get up and walk around a little bit, throw some cold water on your face, and study some more. It's worth it because you get an understanding of God and of His Word. Read elementary. Read inspectionally, but particularly read analytically. Analyze what you read. Then you're able to go take that 4th step. You got to read elementary, you got to read inspectional, got to read analytical, then you got to read synoptically. That is comparing everything you've read to everything you know. We talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke as being the synoptic gospels because they're basically discussing the same things in agreement with each other. A lot of times I read a book that's totally different from this book. They can't both be right. They can both be wrong. But they can't both be right. So what I do, I get other books. And I don't go by the majority rule. I go by what finally rings this bell inside my head. But things begin to make sense because they're related to each other. That's synoptic reading. That's comparative reading. And accumulative reading. And it answers this long question. What does all this material have in common? And how does it add to my understanding of the subject? The first is to see its synoptic nature. What does all this material have in common? The second is to apply that synoptic nature to my understanding in my life, and that's what does it have to do with understanding of this subject. Now, these levels of reading are cumulative. In reality, you never leave any of them. Even though you don't say hat and cat and bat and rat anymore, it's still important to know hat, cat, bat, and rat, isn't it? Isn't it important to be able to know that's the noun, that's the verb, that's the direct object, that's a preposition, that's an adverb? Is that not important? Is it not important to be able to know what the words that I'm reading mean? So elementary reading is still there. Everything that is read should be read, first of all, inspectionally. We need to skim through it systematically so that before we begin to analyze it, we see the whole picture. It's going to be particularly important in studying the parables, in studying the book of Revelation, in studying the book of Hebrews, many other books. But I think of those primarily, where there's so much that is there that must be analyzed and looked at in this way. And then, of course, last of all, you must take all that you've learned, all that you've inspected, all that you've analyzed, and put it together in one package so you can say, this is life. This is what this will mean to me through life. Those are the 4 levels of reading. Now I want to take some time on how to read some very special kind of books that you're going to be reading in your 2 years here. What we've said already would apply to any reading, from McGuffey's Reader to the most technical reference book in all the world. Those 4 levels of reading will apply. But I want to talk about how to use some particular kind of books that your teachers are going to be pointing you to again and again and again. And that you'll be using after you leave here again and again and again. Number one, I want to discuss how to use reference books. By reference books, I mean books like word study books and a book on the book of Ephesians by a certain person, say Martin Lloyd Jones, or a book on Romans by John R.W. Stott, or a book on Scheme Redemption by Ed Wharton. I mean, whatever. How to use those reference books. Number one, have some idea, however vague it may be, on what you want to know. When I go to look something up in a book, I need to know what I'm looking up, don't I? I just don't want to open the book. So I wonder what there is for me to look up here. No, I go to the book with some idea, however vague it is, of what I want to know, what I'm looking for. Then I need to have some idea of where to look for it, where to find out what I want to know. I understand that you can take a software program in a computer and plug in a certain word and it tells you all the different places that word is found. But you still have to think about that, don't you? You still had to know what place on that software to go to, what word to put in, how to use all the different times that word is found. So have some idea, however vague, of what you want to know. Have some idea of where to find it in that book. Number three, have some idea of how that particular reference book is organized. There's books called the Ante-Nicene Fathers, the Nicene Fathers, and the Post-Nicene Fathers. Now, if I want to look up something by Chrysostom, I shouldn't go to the Ante-Nicene Fathers. He didn't live in that time. Not even the Nicene Fathers. He didn't live in that time. I need to go to the Post-Nicene Fathers. That's when Chrysostom lived. Now, on and on we could go. I don't want to bore us with other illustrations. But you must have some idea about how this book is organized. In Ed's book, The Scheme Redemption. If you're wanting to know about the twofold promise, don't look over here where he's discussing the eternal purpose of God in the book of Ephesians. Find a place where he has Abraham there or something there to indicate this is where Ed will be discussing that. That's how to use a reference book. Have some idea, however vague, of what you want to know. Have some idea of where to find what you want to know. Have some idea of the particular how that book is organized, and have some belief. Here's the fourth point. Have some belief in the expertise of the compilers and the authors of the reference book. I personally don't use a reference book that I don't trust the compilers. I don't trust the authors because they're going to be grinding their axe. They're going to be teaching their particular slant on something. Maybe even more importantly, though, how to use a dictionary. What's the dictionary about? It's about words, isn't it? You ever try to read the dictionary? It's interesting, but it changes the subject too often, doesn't it? It doesn't have a theme because it is about words, the meaning of words, the origin of words, the different meaning of words. Words can be used in four ways. Words are physical things. By that I mean you can write them down. You can speak them. They have to do with physical life. They're parts of speech. They're nouns, they're adverbs, they're verbs, they're prepositions. They're all kinds of different things. That determines their grammatical role. Words are signs. They have meaning. Not normally just one meaning, but many. The word foundation. What is the biblical use of the word foundation? But it's Jesus Christ, the foundation of the church. That's right, in Matthew 16. But it's the church itself in 1 Timothy 3, verse 15 and 16. See, the words are used differently. Same word can have different meanings, even in the Bible. What determines the meaning of a word? Two things: context and usage. Etymology, how the word came about, most of the time changes with time. Why does it change with time? Because it's used differently. Paul in 2 Thessalonians, in the King James Version of the Bible, talked about the apostasy to come. He says, but there's one who lets now. When he who lets is taken out of the way, then the mystery of iniquity and the apostasy will be fully known. In 1611, the word let meant to hinder, to stop, like a net, like a ball hits the net, and they call that let. That means the net has hindered the flight of the ball. But by 2000, it doesn't mean that, does it? If I say I'm going to let you do that, does that mean I'm going to forbid you, deter you, hinder you, or allow you to do so? Words change its meaning. Why? Because of the fact that it has been used through the years. That's why when God had the Bible written, He had it written in a language that ceased to be spoken within a few years after the book was written, so that the meaning of that word would be cemented. But even when I know the meaning of the word, it may not mean the same thing in this context as it does in some other context. They're physical things, they're parts of speech, they're signs, but they're also conventional things. By that I mean they're man-made. Words are man-made. And being man-made, they change with usage. They're not God-made. Words are not God-made. They're God-used. Every word in the New Testament was inspired by God to be written, but they're still man-made things. So a dictionary is very important, isn't it? You need an English dictionary. I'd suggest an unabridged one. Webster, of course, is the most famous and popular. But you need a dictionary of Hebrew words. You need, because of Old Testament in Hebrew. You need a dictionary of Greek words. You maybe need a dictionary of theological terms that you're going to come across in books you read. And you want to know what that word means. If you've got a dictionary of theological terms, you just look it up and you find out what that word or that phrase means. Dictionaries are going to be very, very important to you. That's why we have in our library 2 unabridged dictionaries. We have Greek dictionaries, Hebrew dictionaries. If you are studying Spanish, there's Spanish dictionaries. There's Italian dictionaries. There are dictionaries of terms. There are dictionary of thoughts. Over and over again, there are dictionaries. But those deal with meaning and primarily the meaning of a word. More, however, than reference books and dictionaries, you will be using encyclopedias. How to use an encyclopedia. You'll probably hear the teachers talk about the ISBE. That's the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. There's an older one and there's a newer one. The older one's better than the newer one, which is normally the case, but the older I get, the more I believe that. But both of them are very valuable books. You've got Schaff Herzog's Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, McClintock Strong Dictionary. I got all these different kind of encyclopedias. What's an encyclopedia about? Is it about words? No, there are words in it. It's not about words. Encyclopedias are about facts. Things that the world has come to accept as a fact. I think everybody needs a great encyclopedia like the Britannica Encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Americana, something that discusses it from even a secular view. How to use an encyclopedia? Well, that's like saying how to use facts. We need to know some things about facts. Number one, facts are propositions. They're the statement of some proposition. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BC. That's a fact. Now, if you want to learn all about that, go to encyclopedia, look up the word temple, And it'll tell you much more than simply that fact. But that fact is there. Facts are true propositions, not opinions. If somebody said, well, I think, or I believe, or it's my opinion that's not a fact. It may seem like a fact to him, but it's not a fact. It's the statement of some conclusion drawn from some fact. Now, faith is based on evidence. Therefore, it's based on fact. The fact is Jesus was raised from the dead. The belief is, I will too. Based on that fact. But words are also reflections of reality. They may be informational singulars. This is the only fact there is. Or they may be unquestionable generalities, like all Texans are smart. Now, whether that's true or not will be determined by the evidence for that. But it's fairly well an unquestioned generality, isn't it? That everybody from Texas is smart and handsome and good looking and a good preacher. But facts are a reflection of reality. When you talk about Jesus' deity, that's a reflection of reality, of his virgin birth, of his perfect life, of his fabulous miracles, of his resurrection from the dead, of his glorious ascension. All of those are observable, or reflections, on the realities of truth. I believe he's coming again. Why do I believe he's coming again? Because he was virgin born, perfect life, fabulous miracles, beautiful death, glorious resurrection, fabulous ascension. He's coming back. That's my belief, but it's based on the facts. Then you also go to encyclopedias to look at facts because they are also to some degree conventional. As you read an encyclopedia, do not believe that everything stated there is a fact for life. Because some things are true culturally and not simply historically. Those are the things that you will need to remember when you go to use an encyclopedia. Now, we don't have time, and we're not going to take time today to discuss how to read the Bible. There's a book by a guy named Fee, and I forget the co-author, Stewart, I believe it is. They wrote a book on how to read the Bible for all it's worth. I would suggest you get that book quickly, like today, and begin to read that book to discover that each kind of literature in the Bible is approached a different way. And to go just with one style or with one speed, well, with one figure, with one mindset, will not get an understanding of the Bible. Because you have their history, poetry, wisdom, prophecy, allegory, parable, figures, apocalypse, epistles, so many different kinds of material. We'll spend 2 years in trying to convey that thought to you. But you need now to begin to think about how to read the Bible for all it's worth. I just want to close with some comments on reading from God's viewpoint. I'm talking now primarily about reading the Bible, but reading anything from God's viewpoint. In Exodus 24, verse 7, the book of the covenant was to be read out loud to the people. In Deuteronomy 17:19, the king was to read the law every day of his life so that God might be with him. In 2 Kings 23, verse 2, Josiah reads the law to renew the people's covenant with God. They'd forgotten it. But in hearing that law, they made that covenant again. In Nehemiah 8, verse 8, the Levites read the law to the people so that the people can understand God's will for them. 3 times anyway. In Acts 13:27, in Acts 15:21, and in 2 Corinthians 3:14 and 15, the statement is made, the law is read every Sabbath in the synagogue for 1,000+ years, every week. The Jewish men and women and children would hear the law read at least 6 times. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 3, and 12, verse 5, and 19, verse 4, and 21, verse 16, and 21, verse 42, and 22:31, and other times probably Those are just Matthew's account. Mark has them, Luke has them, John has them. The question is asked, have you not read? Have you not read what is said here? Have you not read what David said? Have you not read what Moses said? The question, have you not read, would indicate they should have what? They should have read. God's intent is that His Word be read on a regular and a continual basis. Paul's admonition in Colossians 4:16 was, after you have read this epistle, see that you send it on to Thessalonica, and that you read the epistle from them also. Peter talked about Paul in his epistles, wrote things hard to understand. Has Peter read Paul's epistles? Paul said those people would read his epistles. Peter said, I've read his epistles, and I scratch my head on some of it. But they're Scripture. They're the Word from God. Paul even read non-biblical books. In Acts 17, verse 28, he quotes from an Ephesian poet, or poets, actually. In Titus chapter 1, verse 12, he quotes from a Cretan prophet. And in 2 Timothy 4, verse 13, he says, Timothy, I want you to come here quickly and bring the cloak I left there because I'm cold. But if you don't have room for the cloak and the books, bring the books. Bring my scrolls and my parchments. He was a reader to the end. If we want to be faithful to God as ministers and preachers of the gospel of God, we will learn how to read, and we'll read regularly, and we'll read thoroughly. Let me suggest one thing in closing. Get up every morning an hour earlier than you would have to. Read 10 chapters in the Old Testament, 5 chapters in the New Testament, and you'll read through the Old Testament twice every year and the New Testament 6 times a year. I would suggest you add to that 10 Psalms a day to learn how to worship God, and 1 proverb a day to learn how to live for God. If you will be a full man, from this day forward, you'll give yourself to reading and not just to preaching. God help us to learn how to read His Word.